Hey there, friends. Jerry Robinson here from TrueRichesRadio.com. We have a really quick video for you today on the topic of turning the other cheek. Undoubtedly, if you've read the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says something very strange that many people have a difficult time with. It's a very challenging portion of Scripture. In fact, the entire Sermon on the Mount is, very radical. But if you're familiar with this passage, let's just take a look at it. It's in Matthew chapter 5. Let's look at verse 38 and 39, where it says, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you not to resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also." Now, if you've ever heard a sermon on this topic in the American church, it is very likely that you have, not heard the context for an eye for an eye. It's very rare that you go back and you actually know what that is actually referring to. You may know that it comes from the Old Testament. You may know it comes from the Mosaic Law, but you may not know the context of what's being said. So I want to talk about that today. But then also, you may have heard that, in a sermon about turning the other cheek, that in essence what this is Jesus telling us to be kind in interpersonal relationships, and that if someone insults us, or if someone is mean to us, or if someone cuts us off in traffic, or if someone, curses at us or treats us mean at the water cooler or at work, or the boss is, demeaning, that in essence we are to turn the other cheek. Well, all of those things would be true. Those things are not untrue. But the fact is that none of those really deal with the context of what Jesus is talking about. And when we think about what's being said here, before we drill down to the context, first of all, realize that Jesus is quoting the Old Testament. He is quoting not just the Old Testament, he is quoting the Mosaic Law. So he says, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." Now, where does the Bible say that? Well, we know it's in the Old Testament, but where exactly? So let's go up, and I'm using Bible Hub here, very simple, BibleHub.com, and let's type in eye for eye. And there we see several. We see Exodus 21, we see Leviticus 24, and we see Deuteronomy 19, also Matthew chapter 5, which we just read. So let's take a look at Exodus chapter 21 and see what it has to say. So let's go to Exodus 21. And this is right after the Ten Commandments are given from Sinai. Now, this is the portion of the Mosaic Law having to do with violence, the law concerning violence. So let's come down and see the context of what Jesus is saying, beginning in verse 21. "If men fight and hurt a woman with child, so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm follows, he shall surely be punished accordingly as the woman's husband imposes on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, and stripe for stripe." Okay, so let's make sure we understand what's being said here. Men are fighting, okay? So men are fighting, and a pregnant woman is harmed. And not only is the pregnant woman harmed, very likely she could give birth prematurely, or the child could be harmed, and the child could die as a result of this. In the case, we would say life for life. Or the woman may lose an eye or may lose a tooth. In that case, eye for eye or tooth for tooth. So in this case, we're not dealing with a water cooler incident. We're not dealing with a getting cut off in traffic. We're not dealing with a demeaning boss or someone who is just cursing us out. This is a pregnant woman who has had her baby harmed in her body, or she has been harmed. Someone has been harmed who was an innocent bystander. And why? Because men were fighting. Okay? So men are fighting, men are warring, and then there is someone like a pregnant woman who is harmed as a result of this. Okay? So what the law is prescribing, what the Mosaic Law is telling us, is that if that pregnant woman is harmed, then what should happen to the man who caused the harm? Well, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, or life for life, right? So it's very clear. Remember now, we're dealing with a pregnant woman being harmed, okay? Now, Jesus is saying, in this context, what does he say? To turn the other cheek. In other words, do not demand eye for an eye. Do not demand a tooth for a tooth. In this particular situation, is he quoting the Mosaic law? Yes. So clearly, he is making a statement here that is pretty jarring. Now, before we talk about the other instances of eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth in the Bible, I just want to ask you, when is the last time that you heard about this pregnant wife in a sermon about turning the other cheek? I mean, quite frankly, it is exactly what Jesus is pointing back to. It's interesting how so many times that we will see people insist upon looking at the context. The context is very important. But in this case, quite frankly, think about it. How many times have you heard a preacher bring up the idea of Jesus saying you need to turn the other cheek, and then he points back to the pregnant woman who is harmed, and or maybe the baby in her womb that is harmed, and that this is what Jesus is saying? It is incredibly radical. And I believe this is why you don't hear the context for this, sadly. Now, let's go and take a look also for eye for an eye. We can search for eye for an eye. And we see that it also appears in Leviticus 24. It also appears in Deuteronomy 19. Now, let's go to the Deuteronomy 19 instance to see what is happening here. And this passage does not have to do with violence per se, but it has to do with false witnesses. So again, it's the same law, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. So it's the same exact thing, but it's another instance where an eye for an eye or tooth for tooth would be applied in the Old Testament. So we see here in this case that it's a false witness that's rising up against a man to testify against him of wrongdoing. So let's come down to say about verse 18 in Deuteronomy 19, verses 18 through 21. And the judges shall make careful inquiry, and indeed, if the witness is a false witness, who has testified falsely against his brother, then you shall do to him as he thought to have done to his brother, so you shall put away the evil from among you. And those who remain shall hear and fear, and hereafter they shall not again commit such evil among you. Your eye shall not pity. Life shall be for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Now, there's an interesting phrase in this particular segment of Scripture in Deuteronomy 19, specifically verse 19, where it says that you shall put away the evil from among you. So why are we doing eye for eye? Why are we doing tooth for tooth? Because we're putting away the evil from us. And we see this phrase come up in the Old Testament several times. The idea is that we have to extinguish the evil. We have to get rid of the evil from among us. And the way we do that is by recompense, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So now remember, Jesus is saying that we are not to keep this Mosaic law. Christians who follow Jesus are not to demand eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But why would we do eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth? But to put the evil away from us. But what does Jesus say? Jesus says, resist not the evildoer. So here you have clearly the Old Testament telling us that we have to put the evil away from us. How? By eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But Jesus is coming and saying, you heard that I said an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I'm telling you, resist not the evildoer. So he is clearly pointing back to these instances in the Old Testament where eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth appear, and he is saying something radically different. He is saying to his followers, you are not to pursue eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You're not to pursue revenge, and you're not to resist the evildoer. When he strikes you on one cheek, you turn the other. Now, there is one more verse that appears in the Old Testament regarding this eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth law. And as we know, it's found in Leviticus chapter 24, specifically down in verse 20. Let's take a look at this particular passage, and we should really begin in verse 19 to understand what's happening. Here's what it says. If a man causes disfigurement of his neighbor, as he has done, so shall it be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. As he has caused disfigurement of a man, so shall it be done to him. So once again, this is not indicating that someone has called you a name, or your boss is refusing to give you a raise, or someone is berating you in the grocery store. This is a man who comes and disfigures your body, right? Fractures your body. And Jesus is pointing back to this law that talks about the pregnant woman who is injured by warring men or fighting men. He is pointing back to this law that says that if a man disfigures his neighbor, again, disfigures is not the same as calling someone a name. This is clearly injury. So we're talking about violence and injury. And then in the other passage in Deuteronomy 19, we're talking about someone who is slandering someone or literally falsely testifying against them. And if that person is found out, then he should have what he intended for others, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. Now, it would be helpful if Christian pastors and ministers would actually give us the context for this as we are reading through Jesus' words to find out what is he saying. Because again, when you look up online and maybe Google, what does Jesus, mean by turning the other cheek, you will typically hear interpersonal relationships. Jesus talking again about, being kind to the guy who is, berating you with his words, or being kind to that demeaning boss who won't give you a raise. But none of that is the context here in the Old Testament. None of that is the context that Jesus has in mind. And none of that is the context that the hearer of the Sermon on the Mount knows. He knows what eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is all about. It's about the person who is falsely accusing you of something that could put you to death. He's talking about the two men who are fighting who hurt your pregnant wife. So the basic takeaway from today's video, it's good not to ignore context and to really dig deep whenever we are reading in the Bible. I hope this is helpful to you. Just another reason why we need to listen closely to Jesus and hear what he has to say and understand that what he is saying is absolutely radical, nonviolent love of friends and enemies. We'll be back with another video soon. God bless you, my friends. We'll see you next time.